Good afternoon, Commissioners. Are we ready to start? Please rise for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I need a motion to adopt the agenda. Moved by Commissioner Romano, supported by Commissioner Lucido. All those in favor, say, please vote. Okay. Next item is approval of the minutes. Need a motion on that? Moved by Commissioner Sauger, supported by Commissioner Kraft. All those in favor say aye. Or we'll vote yes, or other on your machine. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Item 5 is public participation. Anyone from the public wish to be heard? Yeah, 5 minutes to speak. Anyone from the public wish to speak under public participation on any item on the agenda? One more time, any public participation? Seeing no one, will close public participation. Item number 6 is presentation of the annual financial report. Schmigel? Floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. On your agenda is a presentation by Plant Moran, our auditors, on the 2017 Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, which you've been provided both an electronic copy and a hard copy. My comments will be very brief in that we have once again received the highest audit opinion you can receive, which is unmodified or clean opinion. We're very proud of that. We've gotten that every year since I've been here. I don't know if we've ever not received it, even in the years prior to my coming on board. I need to make a special mention of my deputy, Steve Adair. He is primarily responsible for putting almost this entire book together and coordinating the entire audit. It takes about 2 months for Plant Moran to do their work. There's 5 or 6 of the auditors in our office every day for about 2 months in a row. They are still in the process of completing the single audit, which is due to be published no later than September 30th. So it's a very extensive, exhausting process, as the auditors will affirm. And Steve deserves all the credit in the world for completing this on time. It gets earlier and earlier every year, and it's all due to Steve's abilities to coordinate and his prior experience in public accounting as well. So we have representatives here from Plant Moran, and I'll turn the floor over to probably Lisa, it looks like. So any other questions I can probably answer as well, but all right, floor is yours.
Get started. Okay, thanks, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Lisa Mineta, Governmental Audit Partner with Plant Moran, and oversee the audit of Macomb County. Pleased to be here again to present the results of the 2017 audit. As Steve mentioned, we are still in the process of completing the audit of the federal programs for the county, since that has a later deadline, but can give the results of the comprehensive annual financial statement report audit. And similar to last year, we will go through a slide presentation to give an overview of the deliverables that we provide in the course of the audit, some background on the audit process itself, and then a very high-level financial summary, and certainly willing to entertain any questions as you have them throughout the presentation. With me this afternoon are Dave Harrington, who is my colleague audit partner on the engagement, and Steve Bondar, who is one of the managers that oversees the very lengthy audit process that Steve described. So first I'll start out with just an overview of the deliverables related to the audit. Again, these are our contribution to the process. As Steve said, the county itself is responsible for the preparation through the finance department of that comprehensive annual financial report that you have in front of you. Our contribution to that is just our opinion on that, which as the result of all of our months of testing is an unmodified opinion, meaning everything contained in that document is fairly stated in accordance with the accounting rules applicable to a governmental entity such as the county and are materially stated and correct. in our opinion. The next document that you have is the Independent Auditor's Report to the Audit Committee, which has 2 sections, which I'll go through a summary version of that. Essentially, that gives an overview of the audit process itself, really getting into how did the audit go, and did we have any unusual items that need to be brought to your attention or need to be emphasized from the process. Lastly, we have a report on internal control over financial reporting and on compliance and other matters based on our audit. There are requirements as your auditors to bring to your attention if we have any significant concerns with the internal control process and procedures that are in place at the county, and that is a report that we would provide to you every year as well when we have matters to be reported. So to give you an overview of the audit process, our starting point every year is just to assess based on our knowledge of the county, our knowledge of the governmental industry, new accounting standards, where are the highest risks of material misstatements. And this is something that we reported at the onset of the audit to you of areas that we identify as requiring additional emphasis and audit attention. So a few things that we identified and addressed in the course of our audit. First off is looking at the completeness of cash and investment accounts. Clearly the county has significant cash and investment accounts that are under the purview of the Treasurer's Office and departments. So we perform procedures to confirm those balances with the financial institutions they're held with, and also test their methods of valuing investments in particular, since in the pension and retiree healthcare funds there are some fairly complicated investments that require some level of estimate in order to determine their value. So we place additional attention there. As we've discussed every year, the county, in our second bullet point, does have certain funds and component units that are on a different fiscal year. So the county itself is on a December 31st fiscal year, where there are other funds that are on September 30th and even a couple on June 30th. So this does create some complexity when we're thinking about reconciling intercompany or interfund balances between and transfers between those entities that are on differing year ends, and looking at how that's reported within the financial report itself. On this page, the last item we have is the accounting for the IRMBT, the Intermediate Retiree Medical Benefits Trust. This is another just complex transaction that the county has, where the proceeds from the bonds were placed into a separate trust from the actual retiree healthcare trust itself. And so that causes some additional reporting requirements that we take a look at every year. 2 other items we have on here. One is, given the significance of the federal grant money that flows through the various departments of the county, there were some significant changes to the rules governing the administration of federal grants, called Uniform Grant Guidance. And so that is an area that, especially this year and in last year's federal audit, we've spent additional time making sure that those standards were implemented and followed. And lastly, again, back kind of to the idea of cash and investments and safeguarding of those, really focusing on any accounts that might be outside of the central treasury function, since there's an additional risk there of misstatement. And so we take a closer look at who has access to those accounts and looking at disbursements to make sure that controls are in place. So looping back to our responsibility in performing a financial statement audit, so our responsibility in a nutshell is really expressing an opinion on the fairness of the financial statements themselves. So in order to do that, clearly we perform many tests of the different account balances over a period of time in order to be able to have a reasonable basis for forming our opinion. We aren't looking at every transaction that flows through the county records, but certainly are focused on those areas that are riskier or more complex, and will use sampling methods to test other balances in that manner. This is an audit that's intended to obtain reasonable but not necessarily absolute assurance that there's no misstatement. Just given the number of transactions, we wouldn't be able to look at every single transaction. But we do have to consider the internal control of the county in order to determine our procedures, again, to identify risks of where misstatement could take place. In terms of the plan, scope, and timing of our audit, we did perform it according to the timing that we expected when we started the planning process. We have various phases of the audit that start back in October and wrapped up in June to issue our opinion. And then in terms of new accounting policies, GASB statement number 74, which pertains to the reporting for retiree health care, was new this year. So if you compare the retiree health care footnote to last year, you'll see it is much more extensive this year. And also some additional supplementary schedules were included giving information on the retiree health care fund. We're also required to report to you related to any significant estimates that are included in the CAFR, since an estimate does represent something that inherently it's not an absolute number, it's based on certain assumptions. And so those types of items within the CAFR, the most significant ones that we look at would be the asset recorded for post-employment health care, the net pension and net OPEB liabilities. Those require the use of actuaries to determine the amounts. And so we do look at the assumptions used by the actuary and evaluate them for reasonableness. Looking at any potential property tax refunds, claims liabilities, and then again, the valuation of any non-traditional investments, those do require a higher level of estimation. A few other things that we're required to communicate at the end of the audit is whether we had any difficulties, significant difficulties in performing the audit or disagreements with management in any of the accounting methods used, and we did not. So we're pleased to report that again this year. And then lastly, other additional information that would be helpful to know looking forward to next year's audit would be there is another new standard that will be effective for the 2018 audit related to retiree health care that actually changes the accounting for it. So we'll be providing information prior to starting next year's audit, which will happen pretty soon. And then we've also included in our report to the board, the full report, some other legislative items that we wanted to keep you apprised of. Switching then to our report on internal control. Again, this is just a summary of the more lengthy document that you've been provided. Again, we're required to report, even though we're not specifically doing a test or an engagement that's specifically focused on opining on the internal controls and their adequacy. We do consider the internal controls in identifying risks. And so as such, if we come across deficiencies in those controls during the course of our audit, we want to, or we're required to, and would want to bring them to your attention for consideration of any changes that should be made going forward. There are some definitions that we use, terminology that we're required to use in describing those, and so we do have 3 deficiencies in internal control that we reported in greater detail that were classified as material weaknesses just based on the size of the balances involved. So the first one is described as inconsistent application of generally accepted accounting principles. And really what that means is during the course of our audit, if we come across proposed adjustments, we gather those, which, as you would imagine, in doing an audit of an entity as significant as the county, it's likely that we're going to find a few things that we propose be changed through the course of our procedures. So we did have journal entries that we presented to management for their evaluation. Most of them were recorded in the financial records and reflected. Some that were deemed to be less significant were not recorded, but that is the reason for that findings included there. We did include, our second bullet discusses the cashiering process and some compliance matters related to the clerk's office. And so that is described in more detail, essentially taking a look at having written policies in place over the cashiering process and also making sure that all bank accounts that are used are reflected and accounted for within the county's books and records. And lastly, we have a separate item, as we did have some accounting matters that were identified specific to the Department of Community Mental Health. Again, these were accounting adjustments that we proposed as a result of our procedures, and those were corrected and reflected in the final CAFR document that you've been provided. So I will pause there before we get into the financial summary to see if there's any questions on those items that I discussed.
Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
Discuss in detail what controls in the clerk's office were there that caused you to issue this statement, and are they still in place currently?
So referring to our report on internal control, we did note that there was at one point a terminated employee that still had access to online functionality of the bank accounts, as well as a lack of written policies and procedures in place over the cashiering process itself. And then again, we did note a bank account that was not reflected in the trial balances of the clerk's office.
Do you know whether that has been corrected?
On that one, I am not certain at this point what the status is, if those
Mr.
have been
Spiegel?
corrected. So I will defer to Steve on that one.
You know, there's a few lingering issues. If you remember, we issued an internal audit report ourselves of the clerk's office last year. I think we had 11 findings. Majority of those have been cleared up. As soon as we get a new clerk, one of the first things on our agenda is to meet with that person and clear the remainder of these items. I'd have to look and see if, to answer your specific question, Commissioner, but they're being addressed. They will all be addressed once the new clerk is elected in November.
But but if someone who was a former employee has access to the bank accounts,
I believe that one's been taken care of, yeah.
okay, all right. Hate to ask the obvious, but, all right, thank you. What about the third bullet point on internal controls at the Community Mental Health Department? What were those dealing with specifically?
Yeah, so that one specifically, we proposed a journal entry in order to, that had to do with the timing of revenue and expense recognition. So that one purely was a year-end closing reconciliation issue. So that would be something we'd recommend next year during the closing process, that be reviewed and corrected appropriately before the audit.
In the first bullet point, talking about inconsistent application of general accounting principles, sounds like it's almost like it was widespread. How? I mean,
It's not so much that it is widespread, and that there were a few different accounting items that again were related not to ongoing accounting matters and day-to-day operations, but specific transactions such as a debt issuance costs and how those are accounted for, and a bond refinance and how that was accounted for. So it was more technical items that have now been corrected in the financial report for the most part.
what hasn't been corrected?
There's a schedule that was attached to the, our report to the board that lists out each of the uncorrected misstatements in the financial statements.
All right. I'll pause my questions now. Let's see. We have some speakers. Commissioner Kleinfeld.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, you'll have to forgive me. When I read on this online at home, we had page numbers according to a packet. We don't have that here because the report is separated out from the packet.
Okay.
So I now can't find any of the stuff
Okay,
that I had
that's fair.
questions on.
We'll find it.
Okay. So the first one is, with regard to the material weaknesses in the clerk's office, were they new material weaknesses from, did they not exist, say, 3 years ago?
So that it's hard for me to say specifically to address each of the specific items. I know that we did have items related to the clerk's office in previous letters that we reported, but I can't say on each of these individual ones.
There were practices that, we knew there were a lot of practices that were initiated in the last year and a half that were concerned to everybody else in the county.
Sure.
Were those in the material weaknesses? Or had they been corrected? Do you know, Steve, if they had been corrected?
Again, I don't know how many of those, a number of them, oh, there you are over there, I'm used to speaking over here. A number of these findings, I believe, are basically issues that we identified as well
Okay.
last fall. So
Yes.
again, some of them have been corrected, not all of them. Once a new clerk is on board, we will follow up and make sure all of those items are, or all the remaining items are addressed.
Okay, now somewhere in this document, and I can't tell you where, I read something related to the trust we created for retiree health care. Could not be counted towards our OPEB obligation as the state sees it, is that correct?
That's correct.
So that would really throw off what the state sees as our percentage of what we have.
That throws off the funded rate, the funded percentage.
Yes.
Again, there's two factors that the state takes into account to determine whether you're underfunded for reporting purposes. One is funded ratio, the other is the
Are
ARC
you
is a,
making the ARC?
the ARC payment is a percentage of total expense or total revenues. And so we're under that threshold, so we're not in a reporting situation. I don't expect we would ever get in that reporting situation.
Okay. According, and I don't know if it was in here, if it was in here, I missed it. We only had, the other package 300 pages long, and this one was
Right.
250, and we had a week to get through it. So what does the state, what does the state see us as funded? What do they believe, how we're funded?
35%, 35.5, I think was the
Okay.
last.
So it
what-
really throws it off.
It does throw it off, because what the criteria is, or the reason that the intermediate trust assets cannot be considered part of the retiree healthcare obligation is, there's that clause in there that allows other uses for those monies in the event that the OPEB plan becomes overfunded. So there's I don't know if you remember, but we can use it to pay defined benefit costs, defined contribution costs. We can use that money to
Well,
pay down and
we
call
were
bonds.
concerned that if we did well enough investment-wise, we would end up down the road, way down the road,
Correct.
having funded that 100%, and now we have this money we can't use for something else, I thought, was,
Well, we can use the money for something else. I mean, it'll be down the road.
Right.
It'll be down the road.
right, but that
Depending on what happens with
clause,
the
I thought that clause was associated with that. We didn't want to commit all that money to retiree health care and make
Correct.
it non-reversible.
Right, and for that reason, it can't be considered strictly restricted OPEB assets. So that's why
Okay.
the actuaries, for accounting purposes, so the state or the actuaries cannot consider those funds OPEB assets for funding purposes.
Right, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Sauger.
Yeah, you just answered my question. I was gonna ask you the condition of the retiree health care plan,
There we go.
so I won't let you go through it again. Thank
Okay,
you.
fair enough.
Commissioner Romano.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm looking at your report on internal control letter. Excuse me. And I noticed that you've identified 3 deficiencies in internal control, but you haven't shown anything in the material weakness. And I guess my question relates to the funds that the prosecutor's office has right now in the amount of over $200,000. Then it says here that there is a reasonable possibility that a material misstatement of the county's financial statements will not be prevented or detected and corrected on a timely basis. I guess my question is twofold. Since we have noted it, since we have recognized it, what is considered a timely basis for this to be corrected where there are not separate funds outside of the control of the treasurer?
So you're asking what would be a reasonable timeline with
Well,
which to
2 reasons.
correct
Why
that,
wasn't it
or-
listed as material weakness? Mm-hmm. And the second question is, what is considered a timely basis since this has been going on for a couple of months now?
Right, so our assessment here is that it has not been corrected on a timely basis, and so the controls are not there in order to do that. So timely basis could be subjective based on the nature of the item. So certainly we would think as soon as possible would be a good timeline to correct these matters and to look at these control situations in order to, provide controls that will correct that in the near term.
If I may, Mr. Schmiegel, I know you're out there. Well, I'm looking at
Page 2.
page 2 of the County of Macomb Financial Statement Audit Report on Internal Control Letter. And it shows the, I was looking at the letter that we received also, the internal letter that we received. I know that you're working on this.
Yes.
Hopefully you're working on this.
Yes.
And where we're at, and why is there such a big time delay, and why the switching of the accounts? And bring us up to date on that, if you would, Mr. Spiegel. That's a lot of money.
In terms of the switching of the tax ID numbers, that question needs to be addressed to the prosecuting attorney. That process was taken or undertaken by that office.
Was that questioned by you, being the financial man?
Well, that's one of the things that triggered the letter to the state of Michigan.
Okay, go ahead.
So, I'd always been made as the letter. A lot of the things I'm gonna say are also in the letter, which I think speaks a lot for itself. I was always of the understanding, as well as others, that there was one forfeiture account that needed to be placed on the books. So, as the letter states, once the inquiry was made by the treasurer's office to the bank relative to the tax ID number associated with the one account that we
Knew about.
knew about, then we find out that there's four. And then
I'm sorry, did you say 4 counts?
there's four, as stated in the letter. The
Four
bank told
counts.
us that there's 4 accounts under the prosecutor's name, none of which are under the tax ID number of the county. That then triggered everything that went on last week, essentially, in terms of contacting the state, having the state determine whether or not, basically, do these things belong on the books, which we're fairly confident, very confident that they do, and whether they need to be in a separate bank account, and who's the basically custodian of the funds. Those are kind of the 3 questions.
Do we know who transferred the funds?
What's that?
Who transferred the funds with the new ID numbers?
I'm not sure of the individual.
I'm not talking about individual.
Yeah.
Was it out of the prosecutor's office?
It was from the prosecuting attorney's office.
That's where it came out of.
Yeah, according to the bank. According to what I hear, the bank. I wasn't on part of the conversation.
I understand
It had to be
that.
something from the treasurer's
So
office.
that money is laying in abeyance right now in some banks, other than the control of the county treasurer.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. Commissioner Gillette.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just follow up on Commissioner Romano's questions, so don't go too far, Steve.
Steve, you might want to just stay up here.
Well, first, I don't know if my memory serves me correctly, but was the issue of the asset forfeiture fund associated with the prosecutor's office identified in last year's audit as a weakness and a concern?
It was.
It was, okay. That's
Yep, and
my,
it's repeated this year.
and it's repeated this year.
Correct.
Okay. And the tax ID number that was on the account/accounts prior to them being changed, Steve, this is, I guess, for you. Was that a tax ID number that was associated with the county that we could then call the bank and get information about the account using that tax ID number that existed before they were changed?
2 of the accounts previously had the tax ID number of the county associated with them until,
Stephen, I'm sorry. Can you speak into that?
oh, I'm sorry. So 2 of the 4 accounts, as I understand, had the county's tax ID number associated with them until a couple of months ago.
Okay.
My understanding also is I've been out of the conversations directly with the bank, but I'm not sure the bank is gonna give us the information about who the tax ID number belongs to and
The
access.
new ones, I assume,
Yeah, the new ones. Well, I don't know if they're new, but anyway.
or the change numbers, I guess.
The change numbers. We know what it is, but it belongs to somebody else. The bank is not telling us who it belongs to, as I understand.
Okay. Now, this may be then for Plant Moran. When you identified this as a concern in the past report, and I guess, I assume in this report too, is it a concern in that the county, that fund may not be in compliance with generally accepting accounting practices, or not in compliance with the law with regard to these type of accounts?
So the nature of our concern is that it would be our understanding that all accounts that are under the purview of the county should be reflected in the county's books and records. So from that standpoint, it is more of an accounting and bookkeeping concern that they should be included, but because they are not included, we cannot comment on the use of the funds or how they're being used because they're not being recorded in the county's books and records.
So your perspective is not necessarily to judge whether or not they're in compliance with the law, but rather or not they're in compliance with The balance
Financial
sheets, the
reporting
financial
requirements.
reporting requirements.
Correct.
Okay. I know that you don't audit every single detail of the county every year. You generally, pick some things and you
Absolutely.
do random sampling. Has this fund or funds been specifically audited by Plant Moran in the time that your company has handled the auditing?
So the prosecutor's office is included in our sampling of, in the course of the audit. So yes, the transactions that are recorded in the trial balance are subject to our audit.
And were they audited?
Yes.
Okay. So the funds that exist, those 4 funds, have been audited.
So I'm sorry, so the issue with the bank accounts that we're talking about is that they're not recorded in the county's books and records, and as such, they can't be subject to our audit. The rest
So
of
they're
the
subject to audit, but they cannot be audited.
so they should be, so they are not, so the actual transactions flowing through those bank accounts are not in the transactions that we're provided to audit, because they're being kept outside of the county's accounting records. So
So they-
we have not audited those, but the rest of the function of the prosecutor's office is included in our audit.
Okay,
So we audit what's included, but we can't audit what's not.
essentially you've audited the prosecutor's office, but you could not audit those particular
Correct.
accounts.
Yes, correct,
Okay, and that was the case obviously last year too.
correct.
Do you know if it was identified as a concern prior to last year?
I don't recall offhand.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you.
Thank you. Steve, if I could ask you a couple questions. I know that we've been having meetings about the budget prior to your presentation for the budget, and I know you've mentioned this to Commissioner Carabelli and Commissioner Kleinfeld, now that this has been in discussion about these funds, correct?
That's correct.
And it sounds to me like the auditing or the actual funds being on the books was not the concern. It was who controls the money from these funds, right? That's what we're looking at here at this point. It sounded like we were and I'm reading this, it sounds like you guys were in discussion with them about turning over the accounts as far as getting them on the books, right?
Yes.
Okay. And back to, I think, what Leon mentioned, some of this issue is over control of the money and who actually has control over the money. And that's what we're kind of waiting for, I think, from the state.
Yeah, my understanding, that there's a difference of opinion between the administration and the prosecutor in terms of who has control of the accounts
Right.
and who has disbursement authorization and control, and even whether or not those funds need to be accounted for or housed in a separate bank account other than the county cash pool. So our opinion is that those monies should flow into the county treasury, be included in the county cash pool, the big cash pool that all the funds participate in, but all the accounting activity, the revenues and expenses, would be accounted for in a separate and distinct fund. It would be a special revenue fund.
And the alternative of this is that the prosecutor's office says that that's not what the law says, that the
But I believe the
control.
prosecutor has a difference of opinion in
Right.
terms of the interpretation of the statutes.
Right. Okay. That's it. I'm curious as to the fact that you guys were in discussions with this, and it seemed, talking to you just last week, that there was no breakdown in these discussions on this, that all of a sudden this turned into an issue. And I know that it's been, Commissioner Kleinfeld for years
I
has been
raised it
talking about
last
it.
year during
And
budget.
obviously
Right, so-
Plant Moran has
so-
talked about it, but now we're finally in discussions with this and moving in a direction, it sounded like. And so all I know is what I'm reading here, and of course what I hear on.
Right. It was moving in a certain direction, and then the timing may seem coincidental, and it certainly is. We were moving in a certain direction, and then the 4 accounts and the changing of the tax ID numbers came to light, and then everything went in the direction that it's gone with the state.
Okay, so we are waiting for the state to either rule on something or decide whether they're even going to look at this, right? I mean, so at this
Correct.
point, it sounds like
Right.
they have a choice to say nothing going on here, or we're going to look at it and tell you what's going on here and whether it should be A or B, or a number of different choices.
Absolutely. You're
Okay.
correct.
All right, thanks.
Mr. Schmiegel?
Stay here, Steve.
When were those, there was a letter sent out to all the county departments about these separate accounts that might be out there to make sure that they're all sent to the treasurer's office.
Correct.
Then it seems like, and in this letter, it says that after June 5th, that shortly after that letter was sent out, these new tax ID numbers were set up.
That's an unrelated matter, Commissioner. So what you're referring to are inquiries from the auditors to the prosecutor's office relative to bank accounts. The letter you're referring to was sent out from my office in the middle of July to have the departments report back to us.
That was after
Yeah,
this issue
absolutely.
surfaced.
Yeah.
But there was, the numbers, all right, but the numbers appear to be changed after it came to light that we were wanting all these accounts with the county treasurer.
Yeah, that was all done prior to the
Yes,
letter
yes.
that I sent out in July.
I got that,
Yeah.
I'm clear, but. And has everyone complied? Has anyone turned in anything that you didn't know about?
Other than the 4 accounts that we're talking about.
Well, we had a problem similarly in community mental health several years ago where there's a problem with some cash accounts. You recall that? And there's a bit
No,
of
I don't,
controversy.
actually.
Yeah. What's up?
As far as I know, though, we are in,
Yeah, those
everybody's
have all been
complied with the
resolved,
letter.
but-
Pardon?
Those are all resolved, but it was
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank on that, Commissioner. I'm
Alright,
sorry.
okay. All right. Maybe it was before your time.
Possible. I've been here a long time, but I'm drawing a blank. I'm
All
not.
right, thank you. Commissioner Leonetti.
Commissioner Kleinfeld was ahead of me.
That's her second round.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Brown. I always try to go ladies first, you know. Good to see you, Steve.
I appreciate
Steve,
it.
yeah, no problems.
You're a gentleman.
Steve, you know, I know a little bit about the forfeiture laws, so I understand the prosecutor's position as saying, look, these are funds from forfeitures, and he's right in the sense that the statute says you can only make expenditures in limited circumstances based on forfeiture law.
Yeah, there's some limitations.
And I certainly understand the treasurer's position too. He's saying, look, that's fine. You know, it's going to be used for that, but it has to come underneath the umbrella of the county general fund, I guess, in a sense, with as you say, a special revenue clause. Is that the position of finance? Is that your position? I mean, because now it seems like we got the state involved because we couldn't solve our problems
Right,
internally.
I would say it's the position of my office, the executive's office, corp counsel, the administration, and the treasurer, that 3 things need to happen with these funds. One,
Okay.
they need to flow through the county treasury,
Okay.
that it's okay to have these funds commingled with the larger cash pool as long as the accounting on the general ledger is completely separate, which it would be. It would be a
Okay.
special revenue fund, much like the sheriff has a grant fund and the child care fund and all those sorts of things. And 3, the activity obviously needs to be on the general ledger. Now, whether the custodian of the funds is the treasurer and not it could be the sheriff, it could be the prosecutor, it could be a department head. Those folks are not the unit of government.
Okay.
As-
So why do we have the State Department of Treasury coming in? What issue are they coming in to sort of help us resolve that we can't figure out
On all
ourselves?
3 of those things.
I guess all 3. We couldn't sit down and figure it out ourselves, I guess is what my question is. Okay.
Again, I'll default to the treasurers or the administration's of an opinion, the prosecutors of an opinion. We
Okay.
need a third party to tell us.
Okay. Plant Moran have any opinion on that, or they don't want to give us an opinion? That's right.
Exactly. I mean, typically, we would see funds such as this. I mean, the county has lots of funds that are, grant funds that need to be used for a particular purpose, Act 51 money that needs to be segregated and used for a particular purpose. So typically, those kinds of things, it's an accounting function, or maybe there is a separate bank account, but it still flows through the general ledger.
Okay.
So unless we're told differently from the state, that's what we would typically see.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Toko.
Thank you. Steve, I have some timeline questions. So this was identified as an issue last year. And did finance, the executive's office, or I think you're grouping it, calling it administration, did administration take a position last year on this?
We knew that it was an issue that needed to be addressed. I'll default to many other things going on in the county, primarily in the clerk's office, taking lots of time. So this was pushed back and identified specifically that something was gonna need to be addressed again after this audit, because it was gonna be a repeat finding. So now everything's cleared up. It's time to move forward, get it cleared up, get it taken care of. And so that's where we're at.
Okay, and can you describe for us the timeline process when it's sent to the state? So what happens now? I mean, does the state make a recommendation?
really
or
don't know
what happens now?
I don't know. They have not communicated back to my office. I don't know, to the treasurer, I don't know. I haven't received any communication, to my knowledge, in terms of where it is at Treasury or what the timeline is.
But so I'm not familiar with that process. So once you send it to are you asking the state to intervene and help? Are you asking the
Yes.
state to make a determination? What are you
A
asking?
determination.
Okay.
More
And
or
do they
less.
do that by hearing or do they do that by,
I just
I
wanted to
would-
briefly
yeah.
respond to your question.
well, if he's answering, I don't understand the process. So I'd like somebody, I don't care who it is, to explain what the process is and what the hope is that we get back from the state.
Sure. So Joe Biano, Chief Deputy for the County Treasurer, Lawrence Franca. Just to respond to your question, we did receive confirmation that the State Treasury did receive the letter sent out by the County Treasurer's Office. They're reviewing it, and they did not give us a time frame as far as what they would respond with, and we're just awaiting the response at this point. But essentially, we're looking for guidance from the state on how to address this difference of opinion between County Treasurer's Office, the Executive's Office, the Finance Department, and Corporation Counsel on one side of the issue with the Prosecutor's Office on the other side.
So that's what my question is it common that is the state the one that would make the determination, and is that binding? So is this an issue that the court would have to resolve a dispute, or is it a dispute that is resolved by the state?
I'm not going to prejudge what the State Treasury Department's going to issue in response to the letter. I would suggest maybe we should wait for the response to essentially see what they say on that, and I think they would address your questions in their response.
Okay, so I guess that's my question. I mean, what prompted you to go to the state? Is that a function of the state to review these issues, or what prompted you to seek intervention from the state? Is that something that they do? Are they going to get the letter? Is there a process for it? Is I guess my question.
I believe there is a process where they review these types of requests, and they do issue guidance to other counties on issues such as these.
Okay, and is there a standard timeline for this, or when you could expect to hear back?
I would defer to the State Treasury Department. I don't believe they give any firm timelines as far as when do they complete a review.
Okay, and then, thank you. Steve, so was this the letter that was passed out to us from the treasurer? Is that issued in conjunction with the administration? It's only signed by the treasurer's office, and you're sort of speaking as a group, as administration, as one group. Is everybody signing on to this letter, or just the treasurer?
Well, this obviously issued by the treasurer, but there's a group of us that are involved in this issue, so we all have input.
Okay, so who is the group? Is it finance, the executive, and the treasurer?
In Corp Counsel.
In Corp Counsel. Okay, so that group is in support of this letter.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else on the first round? Commissioner Kleinfeld.
Okay, we got to do a little bit of correcting here. I told you don't sit down because you need to stand up. Number one, that is from the treasurer, because when that went out, you were unaware of it. Is that correct?
When that went out?
Yeah.
No, I was aware that was going
You
out.
were aware of the one that went to the Michigan Department of Treasury?
Last week, yeah.
I thought we just had a conversation, because I just gave you a real hard time about this. I said last week when you told us you were in the process of correcting this, you were unaware of this.
Yeah, as I recall, that was 2 weeks ago when I mentioned that we were in conversations with the prosecutor's office.
Didn't we just meet last week?
Yeah, but we talked about this 2 weeks ago.
No, we
Yeah,
met.
we met about the capital plan last
All
week.
right,
2 weeks
so
ago.
I just want to correct a
Yeah.
few things. And I don't think it was last year. It may have been the year before last. I brought this up during budget because I raised a question about conferences and training, because his was awfully low, and he said it came out of this fund, which my understanding was one fund, not four. So at the time, and I'm just going to say with all due respect, you may have disagreed with him, but you didn't very adamantly at that meeting disagree with him. You just said, yeah, you know, that's what the prosecutor said was he reports this directly to the state. There are very strict controls on how he could spend that money because it's drug forfeiture money. And my concern was the state was looking at really tightening down on the rules with regard to drug forfeiture, and I thought that that fund was going to take a huge hit, and I wanted to know what was being spent out of that fund that we're going to have to absorb in the general fund, because I saw that coming. I don't think that it ever really materialized what the state was talking about, but you know what I'm talking about. The state was saying we're confiscating too much money without due process. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I thought at the same time I said, how many other funds do we have like this? Does the sheriff's department have any funds like this?
The sheriff department does.
The sheriff's
Similar,
department
they get money from the
does.
state, they get money from the federal government.
And do those funds flow through our accounts?
Yes.
Okay. So in that part I didn't remember. I knew that we had a discussion as to how many of these funds were there. So I just wanted it to be clear that we didn't get a material weakness opinion at the audit last year and the board had not already talked about this. We had had great discussion about it. And it was last week or the week before that Steve indicated to us, I thought it was last week, I was very excited that these funds were going to start flowing through the account. Prior to that, we had expressed our opinion on it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it gets fixed between those two entities, because the prosecutor absolutely was not of the same opinion that I was with respect to how those go. So I think what we're going to get is the Treasury's going to say, yeah, they should, and then the prosecutor will go, okay. Or the Treasury's going to say, they don't necessarily have to, and the prosecutor will say, well, then it's my position that this is going to happen. That would be my guess. But I didn't want, especially you, Leon, to think that this was not raised as an issue, because it was raised as an issue. So when I saw that newspaper article, I was hot about it, because I had with Eric Smith and with the finance department had raised this issue during budget, either last year or the year before. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Gillette.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Kleinfeld, for that background. I think what the most frustrating thing about this is it has been discussed. As Commissioner Kleinfeld pointed out, it's been discussed. It was identified as a material weakness in the past. It's been discussed at multiple meetings. I guess I'm wondering how many more years of discussion we're going to have before this issue is resolved. I mean, I know that it was brought up before, and you identified, Steve, that there was a lot of problems we were having with the clerk's office and other issues, so it didn't get top billing. But it was identified as a problem in a previous report. It's been in discussion. And at what point does the discussion end? And this get brought into the county oversight? It was pointed out that there's very strict controls over how those funds can be used by the state, and the prosecutor's office has to be in compliance with those. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. What we're not talking about is taking control of the money. What we're talking about is being able to audit how that's being spent. How do we know that that money is being spent as it's supposed to be spent by the state if Plant Moran can't even audit it? So it's not a question of whether or not the prosecutor has a right to use the resources in a manner consistent with law. It's just whether or not the prosecutor is subject to the same audit that the rest of the county is to make sure that that's how it's being administered. Now, to the Plant Moran, you identified this as a material weakness, probably because in other communities, they don't have these things in accounts that cannot be audited. Is that correct?
To my knowledge, yes, that's correct.
Do you know of any other, I mean, there's other counties surrounding us of similar size or any place across Michigan. Have you run into this problem in any of the other communities that you're aware of that Plant Moran has audited?
I will pause on, do you want to handle that one, Dave? I wouldn't have, yeah.
Okay.
I've been around a long time. So I'll say 30 years ago that was common.
Okay, 30 years ago it was common. Is it common today?
So it is not common today. The trick is finding out. So here's the issue. This isn't a bank account that the finance department may or may not know about.
They may or may not even know about?
Point of information, the treasurer's office does business with this bank. In fact, they hold $40 million
Well,
of our assets.
Yeah, so what ends up happening, and this happens in school districts and many governmental units, so this is not just a municipal thing, is someone opens an account, they put it in the county school, or the county ID number, but they don't let Treasury know, because, it's my drug forfeiture, or it's my PTO money, or it's this money. And then we come along and we say, hey, bank, do you know of any other accounts? This bank happened to tell us about one account. We said, wait, that's not on their books and records. We better talk to Steve, and that's how it came out here. So that's why Lisa has to say, to the best of our knowledge, we're not aware of, and the point is a lot of times it's very confidential, the spending, there's a lot of, when you get to when it gets to that area, it's a very sensitive, but the point is it gets recorded, and then we make sure there are controls in place that the spending is appropriate. But if it's not on the books and records, as mentioned, we can't audit it. They don't have the information, and so, again, we were aware of one account. The other 3 accounts we found out at the same time you guys did, and that was as the bank said, oh, well, there's 3 other ones, I'm sure, to the treasurer or somebody. So, because if you think about it, it's hard to audit something we don't know exists. And so we did the best we could. And that's why it's so important for us to report it to you, because we need action to make sure we can audit it.
Well, that makes sense, that we should know they exist. To your knowledge, has this been a problem in specifically Oakland County, Wayne County?
Not to my knowledge. If it has been, I'm not aware of it.
Okay. And this might be something for Steve, or maybe probably for our attorneys, but is this information public information in the sense that could some citizen come in and submit a FOIA request and review the bank account and look at the expenditures and its
Clarification, one
Yeah.
of the discussions in budget about this is because of the nature of where these funds come in, how they can be spent, a lot of how they're spent is confidential.
Correct.
Because, okay, let me give you an example. You're buying a drug car for an undercover unit. You can't have the public knowing the make and model of that. You're buying a car and
But we can know that there's a car being
purchases.
purchased.
Huh?
Well, we can know there's a vehicle being
I
purchased.
was giving you an example. There are things that are purchased that have to remain confidential because of the nature of the investigative units that get some funding from that. That was part of the conversation.
Thank you, Commissioner Kleinfeld.
I guess that makes it extra complicated. When you've got a fund that we don't know exists and that we're not allowed to tell people what we're buying, and that there's the excuse that, there's all these reasons why nobody can know how it's being used, and not even the county knows how it's being used, and the auditing firm doesn't know it exists, and they can't audit it. And then when we ask the question of how it's being used, we're being told that, well, it's a secret because, it might be needed to be a secret. How is there any then, what are the oversight of a fund that apparently it's too secret to audit?
Well, Commissioner, first of all, no one said it was secret. That was her opinion. So let's wait and see what the state has to say about that. I mean, obviously, anybody involved in government today knows that transparency is the watchword, that you gotta have open books to everybody, including the public. And you can't have private accounts sitting on banks that no one can audit. And everyone knows it's within this county length of time. Everything goes to the county general fund, not in a separate accounts for your own private transactions within your department. Everything's gotta go through the general fund.
Mr. Chair, this is probably...
Hopefully we get the state letter to clarify what the law is.
Mr.
but-
Chair, what if the state says, well, we don't want to get involved?
Well, we'll worry about that question when we get there. I don't know.
Well, what if the state takes 10 months? I mean, I
I'm not
wonder
gonna
how patient,
speculate.
we've waited a couple years to
Well,
get this material weakness addressed.
Well, we
and
expect it, well,
I hope the state is going to say, yes, we're happy to help and let's get a clarification and get this resolved. I hope that's the case. But as Commissioner Toko indicated, I'm not even sure that's necessarily their required duty. It might be a favor. I don't know. if
Well,
it's a
also-
favor we're asking them,
I
or,
think it's also in the charter. I think that it's pretty clear thing in the charter that all the money allocated, spent to the board, comes to this board. He doesn't have the authority to allocate money to his department through a separate, through his own special fund. That's a special fund that would have to be set up by this board, allocated by
So-
the finance department.
so we believe that charter establishes that as a fact for us. So what are we waiting for the state for?
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
You asked a question about, nobody gets to know about this. The prosecutor made it very clear that he has to report to the state on these funds. He has to, I don't know what the nature of the report is, but that may not answer your question.
No,
I
that tells
just-
me he has to report compliance with the law, but the auditing to make sure that this is why things are audited, there's not just laws, you
Correct.
audit them to find out and make sure they're in compliance with them and so forth.
Commissioner,
Okay, I mean, at some point, Mr. Chair, I'm going to wrap up real quick here. At some point, there's got to be a deadline. We've been waiting for a couple years for this to get resolved. The discussions, we're hearing about ongoing discussions. Maybe the state's going to do us a favor and rule, and maybe they'll rule quickly. But if we believe that the charter puts these funds under the umbrella of the county and that kind of oversight, at some point, we've got to insist that happen and take whatever action is necessary.
That's right, and one step
Okay.
at a time. Let's see what the state says, and if they go on in a longer period of time, then we'll ratchet up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So, thank you, Commissioner Gillette. Anyone else that want to speak on this subject? Because they have some more on this report they have to go through.
But to respond to Leon, too, as a point of information, I believe it was our general counsel that said we're going to get the state involved. I think after this came up, I think Corporation Counsel said, let's have the state make the decision. So for whatever reason or another, our attorneys have felt that that's the way to go, if I'm not mistaken. Well, I think according to Mr. Biondo, they said maybe 6 to 8 weeks before we got an answer. Is that correct? I don't know if he's still here.
Come, please speak into the mic for the record, please. Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner. In response to your question, all we've received from the State Department, Treasury Department, is that they received the letter, they're reviewing it. No timeline as to when they'll respond. Of course, as soon as we receive a response, we'll share it with the board.
While you're there, Joe, it was Corporation Counsel that decided to go to the state on this. Is that correct?
I would say it was the treasurer's decision to send the letter that he sent to the state.
Okay.
But we had discussed it with the Corporation Counsel, Finance, and we all essentially agreed that that was the right move to make in light of the facts that were uncovered last week.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I would say, as the letter outlines, when we discovered those material facts last week, that we thought it was necessary to take it to the state immediately in order to hopefully get a quick response, and that's what we're hoping for. You're welcome.
I got a question. We were trying to find, where in the audit does it say it's a qualified or unqualified audit?
It's called unmodified. We have-
Yeah, we don't have the CAFR.
it's-
Page. It's on our audit opinion.
Yeah, it's about 3 pages long. The attorneys have won the opinion. A1, right after the tab called Report on Independent Auditors. It starts at A1 and ends at A3. It's fabulous reading. You can see it online as well. Oh, where in there?
Oh.
So under the first page, there's opinion.
Just under opinion.
Yeah, the very first page, A1, it says, in our opinion, in our opinion, finance statements referred to above present fairly in all material respects the financial position, ... of the government in accordance with governmental, like that paragraph is.
Under opinions.
Under the word opinions.
Correct. If there was a modification, there would be a separate paragraph that would.
Oh, it doesn't
describe
have the word
modification.
unmodified.
Correct.
We say it's The technical term is, the opinion, your financial reports are fairly presented, so they're accurately presented.
If that were not the case and it were
Then we would
modified,
modify it.
there would be different language. So the fact that this
It
is
would-
the standard
we would say,
language is unmodified.
We think it's good, except this, and this are not correct. And that's common in commercial world, it's not as common in governmental.
Thank you.
So that's a very good point. We were using technical terms. The opinion's the clean opinion, to use a very straightforward, it's a clean opinion. If there was a modification to it, it would be included in there. Yours is not modified. Very fair point. Okay, anything else on the first half of the presentation? All right,
Okay,
Steve,
Take it away.
we're on to the numbers.
Thank you. So the next slides that I'm going to go through show the financial results for the year under audit, as well as some historical data. And I'll quickly run through these slides, and I'll point out a few items of note, and then we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have on it. So going back to the graph presentation, the first slide on page 7 details revenue for the general fund for the last 4 fiscal years. Total revenue in the general fund ranged from approximately $190.4 million in 2014 to approximately $228.1 million in 2017. A few items to specifically point out. Transfers in 2015 included a $30 million transfer from the delinquent tax revolving fund as part of the pre-funding of the retiree health care costs in the IRMBT. In 2016 and 2017, these transfers primarily consisted of the annual budgeted transfer from the delinquent tax revolving fund, and this is for general operating purposes, and those were at approximately $8 million each. And then finally, you'll notice there's an increase in other and federal and state grant revenue, and this increase in other primarily relates to an increase in charges to other funds, and an increase in federal and state grants relates to an increase in state appropriations resulting from property tax reform. The next slide is going to be general fund expenditures. This covers the same period from 2014 to 2017. And expenditures increased over the period from approximately $186.8 million in 2014 to approximately $236.1 million in 2017. These increases were primarily driven by transfers to other funds for capital projects and the pre-funding of retiree health care. The next slide, so on the previous 2 slides, a lot of the variability from the results comes from the transfer line items. So this next slide shows a 10-year history of transfers out of the general fund to other funds. So this is to kind of help explain just the general trend in those changes related to transfers. And the blue bars on this slide are your operating transfers. The orange bars are your capital transfers. And then one thing I'll point out is for the purposes of this slide, we excluded the transfer for the pre-funding of retiree health care costs in 2015, as that transfer wasn't really an operating, nor was it obviously a capital expenditure. So it was kind of a one-time thing. So that's pulled out so as to not distort the trend here. And you can see for the last 5 years, the blue bar, your recurring transfers, has been approximately $25 to $35 million. And examples of these transfers would be funds transferred to other funds as part of the county's match on like federal or state grants, or transfers to other funds like community mental health that are recurring in nature for operational purposes. Another item I'll point out on this slide is you'll notice a dip between 2011 and 2012. This was the result of a new accounting standard whereby previously there were certain funds that used to get reported separate of the general fund. And then with a new accounting standard, they got rolled up into the general fund. So as those were previously supported by general fund transfers, now that they're part of the general fund, those transfers were not required to be made. So that's the dip you'll see between 2011 and 2012. And then finally, the last slide. This slide details general fund balance as a percent of general fund expenditures. Thank you. One item to note here, depending on the information you're looking at, these percentages may appear different. And that's because it depends on what's being included in the fund balance or what's being included in the expenditures. So for example, this particular slide shows fund balance as a percent of general fund expenditures excluding transfers. So these are just expenditures from the perspective of day-to-day expenditures. And that's just to give you a general idea of the trend of fund balance over the historical period covered by the slide. So as you'll see on this slide, in 2008, fund balance was approximately 15% of fund balance, and that peaked in 2014 at approximately 46%. And this was as fund balance was accumulated in anticipation of addressing deferred capital and maintenance costs. And then that was down to approximately 29.8% in 2017. And we'd be happy to take any questions anyone has on the financial results portion.
I guess with this last chart here, it said you look at these percentages and they say a story depending on how you look at them.
Yes.
I didn't quite understand. If you explained it, I didn't quite understand what you meant. Maybe you could clarify that a little bit better for me.
Yeah, so if you're looking at various different reporting documents, either budget documents or perhaps the annual financial report, you may come up with slightly different percentages depending on which piece of information you're looking at. And that's because it depends on what you're including in either fund balance or in expenditures. So in some cases, expenditures will include both the day-to-day expenditures as well as transfers, and other documents will exclude transfers. So depending on what you're looking at, you may see a different percentage. What I wanted to point out on this one is this does not include transfers.
Okay.
This is just kind of giving you the trend relative to just day-to-day expenditures.
Day-to-day operations.
Yep.
Okay. It didn't say that anywhere on this chart, so that's why. Okay.
Yep, happy to
Day-to-day operations. I'm going to make a note on that for this. Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, I think this was it.
This is the last one,
That
yep.
concludes. So, yes, so we're happy to entertain any other questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some general questions for you. When you do other counties and you're doing their audit, have you looked at the full faith and credit that those counties guarantee as far as backing Department of Public Works bonds and the effect of that? And is there a rule of thumb percentage that should always be considered?
So there is a governmental accounting standard that does cover whether or not liabilities of other entities, such as Public Works, are included within the financial report. I believe that's based on if there is a probability that says it's more likely than not that the county, for example, would have to pay Public Works debt. That would have to be included as a liability within the financial statements. But in terms of if you're talking about a percentage, like what's a good percentage or what isn't.
And I understand more than likely it'll never happen, but they look at it, it is a liability, and it does affect your long-term borrowing of future dollars. So I guess I'm asking, is there a accounting practice that says, we've argued year after year of how much money should be left, cash on hand in the general fund, and somebody will say this much, and somebody will say it's this percentage.
It's called bonded indebtedness. It's the term that they use.
Well, agree, but
Percentage of bonded indebtedness to
Well-
your revenues.
what percent is that number that you have to be careful with?
So
We
I'd
go
say-
out and put $1 billion of full faith and credit, and then all of a sudden, it hurts our bonding capability for the rest of the county.
Yes. I was going to say, Steve might have we'll let this Steve,
I'm going to discuss this matter tomorrow, actually.
Okay, all right.
So I've got a slide about
Perfect.
Direct debt as a percentage of revenues, as they call it. So I've got a slide on it tomorrow.
I appreciate that, thank you. Mr. Chairman, with another question is, district courts, circuit courts are operated and maintained by the county, general fund, and the populace. and most of, actually all district courts that I was always aware of are funded by local municipalities. That's why they fund a district court. We, though, in Macomb County have 2 district courts that are backed by the general fund, the taxpayers at large. Is this a standard practice that you've seen in other counties, or are we unique to that?
Back to the old guy. So, yes, as long as I've been here, we've had the 2 district courts at the county because the governmental units have not accepted the DCU responsibility. That is common throughout the state. That I can't give you numbers off the top of my head, but we're not alone. And it is a source of frustration at the county level. You know, at the local level, their response is we don't have the wherewithal to fund this court. You know, I've seen both sides of it. But it is not unique to Macomb County.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question, Mr. Chairman, if I can.
What is it? And I'll tell you. Just tease it.
The year after year from the audit that you guys, you've done it for 4, how many years have you done? I know you were gone for a little bit. I
This
think.
was year 6.
Year 6. Every 2 years, or every year, the Board of Commissioners will adopt a purchasing policy and enact it into the appropriation ordinance. Are you also auditing to make sure that those ordinances are being followed? No.
So inherent in our audit, when we're looking at contracts, we do look to see compliance with the purchasing policy.
You do, and when that changes, you guys are changing?
We're looking at the
your
current
restriction.
policy that was in place for that particular expenditure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you do samplings.
Correct. We're not looking at every
So that's different,
contract or
Commissioner Carabelli.
expenditure. Yep,
So don't take great comfort in
on a
that.
sample basis.
Thank you. All right. All right. Any other questions on the audit? There's been a motion made to receive and file the audit. Please vote in affirmative or negative. There's already been, Commissioner Sauger made it and Kraft supported it earlier. Thank you very much. We'll be in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Item 7 is new business. Any new business? Seeing no new business, public participation. Anyone from the public wish to be heard? Anyone from the public wish to be heard? We have one person from the public. Please state your name and address for the record.
Yes, my name is Bob Brandenburg, 21416 West Point, Clinton Township. I'm here because yesterday I read the newspaper article, which was interesting, and I decided to find out when your board was meeting and found out the audit committee was meeting. It was convenient. So I came here and I thought it was educational, what was discussed. But I have 2 concerns that were raised yesterday and more so today. The main one was the change of your tax ID. I mean, who has these funds? Mr. Drollet said that a Freedom of Information Act request might be made, and I think your county should do so to find out who the owner of those accounts are. Because if it's a public agency, they have to respond and at least give you the name of who owns the accounts. If they refuse to answer, that suggests it's not a public entity, in which case I think you have serious problems and you can't wait for your state to do whatever your state wants to do. So I think that has to be resolved immediately. And my guess is actually if you ask your prosecutor, he's committed to transparency and he should tell you what the entity is that owns those accounts. My second concern is eventually this is going to get resolved. But what happens in the meantime? Because transparency is an important issue, as Commissioner Brown said. I would suggest that the prosecutor be approached and asked not to give signatory authority to the treasurer or the finance committee or necessarily any control other than access to these accounts so they can be looked at. And even if they're restricted funds, I'm an attorney. I could write up an agreement for confidentiality almost immediately, and I'm sure corporate counsel can do so, to allow the Treasury Department and your Finance Department to oversee these while the issue gets resolved. And I think that's of quite a bit of importance because you just don't want things floating around. And I think it's in the interest of your prosecutor to have someone looking over his shoulder so no one can accuse him of doing things wrong. So those are your two things I'd suggest the commission or maybe executive do immediately. And that again is to find out who owns these and make sure it's a public entity. And if it's not a public entity, I think your prosecutor has to get involved. And your second thing is to have some type of access by someone outside the sheriff's department to keep an eye on what's going on until it is resolved. And that protects everyone, and I don't think it's unreasonable, and I think your prosecutor actually probably would appreciate that type of oversight. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else under public participation? Anybody else under public participation? Seeing no one under public participation, we'll ask for a motion to adjourn. Moved by Commissioner Gillette, supported by Commissioner Kraft. Please vote. The vote passed, 12-0. We are
And
adjourned.
we don't have this set up as a joint meeting, so we're gonna call as soon as this is done, we're gonna call the finance to order.